Hi, I'm Mohanan.
Hi, I'm Tara.
Um, this is going to be not a regular talk, talk
Yeah,
about our research, but it's a conversation between the two of us.
yeah, and it's a conversation in which um, we will do it in four parts or perhaps five parts. Um, we will begin with a kind of broad story of the evolution of linguistics over since the 50s. Then we will go on to some of the important things that we will talk about specifically, and then go into three parts of the substance
Yeah,
of the conversation,
yeah,
and in the end we'll try and pull the pieces together.
mm,
So yeah,
yeah.
uh,
It's more on the kind of education talk rather than
it's not just
research talk.
it's not
Yeah,
just education, but the perhaps you could call it the sociology of research,
uh,
sort of. No, not
not really.
quite
So
sociology, not the
epistemology of
okay,
linguistics research
yeah.
and the kind of leading ideas which have come in the theoretical phonology and theoretical phonetics.
Leading ideas and theoretical questions and major
Yeah.
shifts. I think
So this is not going to be about the latest theory available, latest framework available, and so on.
nor will it
Yeah.
be about the work that we have done.
Yeah.
So, actually, before we start, just to place what we're saying in
Mm.
context, we've been extremely fortunate to have been perhaps in the right place at the right time and been able to sort of not just be restricted to phonetics and phonology, but we've worked in phonetics, phonology, morphology, syntax, and semantics, as well as a little bit of applied stuff. And then gone on after a certain point to taking what we've gathered from there to the study of, for example, mathematics, the physical sciences, biological sciences, human sciences, and all of that. So
Yeah.
we are trying to bring a little bit of that perspective into
Yeah. Bring
this
that back to linguistics.
linguistics.
Yeah.
At the same time, without straying too much out of phonetics and phonology.
We'll try to do that
Try
at
to,
least.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's sketch the kind of evolution of the major landmarks
Yeah.
of the evolution of
Right.
phonetics phonology. Maybe we should begin with
I
this.
think IP as the first switch perhaps was IPA to distinctive features,
That's right.
uh,
Yeah.
driven by the Brown School,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And then from after that, so it was distinctive features which were used all the way up to Chomsky and Halle in 1960.
Sound pattern of
Yeah,
English.
sound pattern of
Yeah.
English. And after that, that kind
Around-
of continued
Yeah.
in
Till about 70s, like 74, 75.
early 70s.
Yeah.
So
With Kant's thesis on syllable structure.
yeah, and then came all of the so-called non-linear phonology, and then came shifts in the modularity. So these are the kinds of things we're going to focus on, which are the major components of the architecture of linguistic theory, perhaps all theories. But I don't know if everyone sees it that
Yeah.
way, but at least for linguistics, yes.
This is going
You
to be
have-
our personal perspective
Right.
of how the evolution,
Happened,
played out.
yeah.
Yeah.
And we'll do it primarily in three components: the rules and rules or constraints, however you want to see it, rules and constraints, the representational systems, representations in phonetics and phonology, and the modularity of grammar. So these are the elements that contribute to the central elements
Yeah.
that contribute to the architecture
Architecture.
of a theory,
Yeah.
or a framework, or a model,
Yeah.
whichever. Yeah.
And we are going to emphasize the ideas, the leading ideas of the theoretical issues, the central questions about these leading ideas. And we will also touch upon we'll separate the leading ideas from the formalisms, because the same ideas can be expressed in different formalisms, some of them which may have some empirical consequences and others not. But these two must be kept separate from the notation the way in which the formalisms are expressed.
So the same formalism can be expressed in different notations, whether it's Venn diagrams and versus tree diagrams, boxes versus circles, or
arrows and
lines and arrows, what those lines mean.
And the terminology, a lot of terminology, which is they express the same theoretical ideas.
Right. So now it's also important to keep separate the formalisms and notations on the one hand, and the theoretical substance that they're trying to express on the other.
And we'll be focusing on the theoretical ideas.
Right.
And the sense that we have when we look at the evolution of phonetics, phonology, or syntax is that some of the leading ideas, once they emerged, have remained the same, with mild changes. But so we are trying to outline what the core of these ideas, the things which are unchanged.
So I think what we will focus on are the major conceptual changes in the theory.
Right. Not the technical formal changes. We'll also talk about formal changes, but our interest is in the conceptual aspects of linguistic theory.
And I think we also will, because of our experience with syntax and semantics and so on, we will do some cross-referencing where relevant.
Yeah. Minimally, and maybe make some reference to science in general, or even
maybe
we can't help mathematics and so on.
We'll see how it goes.
So is this a good time to stop and
stop for questions or very briefly? Let's
only for sort of clarificatory questions, not for other kinds of.
Actually, we'll follow that path. We will do this in small parts, 4 or 5 parts. At the end of each part, we will stop for clarificatory questions. And then once all of these parts are done, then we will have general questions and comments on all of the parts together. Hi. So now we'll go on to talk about rules or constraints. We might use the term laws or principles instead of rules, but they all mean the same thing. Okay? We're not making any distinctions. The major distinction is between rules and constraints, where when you talk about rules, you're talking about procedures, right? And typically, rules are associated with something that happens sequentially, and constraints are associated with some kind of a simultaneous application type thing. So there is always this has been a struggle, I think, a conceptual struggle all through. Should the patterns and the pattern interactions be stated in terms of rules or constraints? Should the models be sequential or simultaneous? So that's one major conceptual idea that has sort of been part of linguistic theory all through.
One of the interesting characteristics of theoretical linguistics, and when we say theoretical linguistics, we are talking about the kind of formal theoretical linguistics that started with Chomsky's PhD thesis and syntactic structures.
1956 syntactic structures.
This essential characteristic is a way of expressing regularities in terms of algorithmic statements, procedural statements, which he inherited from Alan Turing.
Actually, all the way, not just Alan Turing, all the way from Panini.
Oh, that's true. Panini and Alan Turing together, Right. So this is peculiar because in sciences like physics, laws are stated in declarative terms. So everything attracts everything else. Newton's idea is not a rule. It's not a procedure. It's a statement of a regularity, a constraint, positive constraint or negative constraint, doesn't really matter. So we are focusing not on the distinction between rules and constraints, but on the law part, that which is neutral, not the computation algorithm part. This continued from the sound pattern of English. This way of the Paninian or the Alan Turingian mode continued all the way till about, I would say, about the end of 70s, when
Early 80s.
right,
Yes.
early 80s,
Early
yeah.
80s is when, yes, it
When
shifted.
there were also constraints, there were rules and constraints, and people felt this is overkill.
Overkill meaning you can't have both
Yeah.
rules and constraints, because rules are stateable as constraints and constraints are stateable as rules.
Yeah.
So you shouldn't allow both.
Yeah.
That's why the overkill.
Yeah. And one of the characteristics of rules is that they apply one after the other in a sequence, in a kind of derivation, like you could say in a mathematical derivation. But mathematical derivation is not ordered. The linguistic rules are in phonology as well. They're ordered rules. What does ordering do? So because of this worry that it is overkill, I think it was in Berkeley, there was a conference.
I think it was 82.
Something like that.
Early
Yeah.
82, yeah.
Yeah. Or maybe later. Berkeley conference was
82.
86, 87,
Oh, okay.
something like that.
Okay.
Yeah. But we are not quite clear about the.
I don't remember because there were two such
Yeah.
conferences.
A large number of phonologists came together to explore the possibility of phonology without ordered rules. Quite a few of them. And we were actually part of that revolution. And the idea was to state everything in terms of constraints. But then we discovered that when we moved from rules to constraints, there was something that we were keeping together. How do we translate rule ordering into a system of constraints?
Now, rule ordering was necessary because it allowed you to resolve certain conflicts. So, conflict resolution was another sort of idea that ran through all of this. And you might understand it if we say that rule ordering does the same thing as ranking or strength assignment in OT.
Yeah.
Right. That's a parallel.
Yeah. So let's take a simple example. You could say, if you take the word writing, W-R-I-T-I-N-G, there are two things that you can say about it. One is to say that the t sound is voiceless. That's one. But then you also say that in between vowels in an unstressed syllable in American English, it is realized as a flap.
Not as a
tap.
stop.
Yeah.
So rider.
Rider.
Right.
Yeah. So in at the phonetic level, it is actually a voiced tap. So there's a conflict between these two statements. This is voiceless and this is voiced. How do you resolve these things? Okay. And this became an important question. Rule ordering, it was fairly simple. There were various ways of resolving this. In the constraint idea, what Tara referred to as non-monotonicity, in the computational jargon, or diffeasible logic, non-monotonic logic or diffeasible logic in the formal logic systems. The idea was that there is kind of priority assignment, and this could be in terms of constraint ranking, as it happens in optimality theory, or in terms of strength assignment in
some versions,
diffusibility logic. Yeah. And there are some empirical differences, but we are not going to go into the details of these different formalisms. The basic idea here is that there is conflict resolution in rule ordering, constraint ranking, strength assignment, all of them. Yeah. There is another aspect.
No, is it a good idea to give the conflict resolution with rider and rider?
Yeah, okay.
Right.
Yeah. Maybe we should, instead of using Canadian English, we should choose an example from Malayalam, for example.
Okay.
So in Malayalam, there is these two words which pronounce slowly without,
in a formal
way. One word is mantan with a t, and the other is manden with a d. Mantan, well, this is not the way you normally pronounce it, but doesn't matter, is a fat one. Manden is a slow one. But in actual speech, in regular speech, it comes out as manden. Both are voiced, and this is because after nasal, the voiceless stop becomes voiced. However, the distinction between the two is retained because there is another rule of constraint which says that after a voiced consonant, there's a kind of vowel on glide So after the, as in there, the.
Actually, mandan and manden.
Yeah.
The. So, and the thing is that no speaker of Malayalam would mistake one for the other.
Yeah. In fact, if you asked speakers of Malayalam, are they saying the or the, they will insist that they are saying the in Mandan. Yeah. Ambalam, they'll say it is a per that they're saying. They will not hear the voice sound.
Temple.
Yeah. Right. Even in English. Yeah. So in rule ordering, this is very simple because what you do is you do the vowel on glide first and then you voice. So when the on glide rule happens, the is still voiceless, and after that it becomes voiced. Perfectly fine. How do you do this in terms of constraint ranking? That these things become slightly problematic. Now, in the Berkeley conference that we suggested, one of the ideas was that in addition to diffusible logic and so on, you have three kinds of rules. So actually two kinds. One, rules or constraints that apply at a given level or given dimension of representation. And so you could have constraints on the phonological level or the phonetic level. There are, two different ways of doing it. And then you could also have constraints that connect the two. So you could say, if the phonological representation is such and such, then the phonetic representation is such and such. Now, if you include this as well, you can take care of a large number of cases of rule ordering in terms of constraints. So two general ideas about interaction between rules. One is to factor it out in terms of diffusibility, and the other is in terms of where the rules apply, across levels or within a level.
Actually, it's two different strategies to take care of the same problem, the problem being a conflict. So, two different ways of resolving the conflict.
Yeah. And if you do it that way, phonological theory becomes like any theory in science. Okay, we state the laws governing representations.
I don't think the kind of controversy between should we have rules or constraints is still quite resolved. That's an ongoing. Unless you're within a particular bandwagon that subscribes to one or the other.
Yeah. But we won't talk about
the details or any particular theory.
We'll just pose these questions because it's important for graduate students to engage with these questions. It is not for us, like senior citizens, to do that kind of research. We are not going to do that, but we hope the graduate students will be able to look at some of these issues and
resolve some of them, maybe.
Yeah. The kinds of things that we were not able to do, you should be able to do now. That's the idea. Okay.
Is that a good time to?
Yeah, let's
All right.
do that. Yeah.
Let's now talk about representations and representational systems. Now, this is probably particularly relevant in linguistics more than any other science, where you have representations, and I mean we can actually see rules or constraints as being the expressions of regularities in representations, which is why representations and representational systems are so central to linguistic theory.
So we don't state the laws directly on the entities out there. We represent sentences and words, and then we state the regularities or the laws on those representations. So this is the way linguistics has always
has developed ever since 56.
So we begin with, let's see, the
Prague School. So before that, you had the IPA.
Right. This is for the representation of categories of phonological segments.
Right.
Okay. So you say something like the word bit has 3 segments, and we have to classify b, classify e, classify t.
Right. And you call b a voiced bilabial plosive.
Yeah.
And and within this system, you have a way of describing or representing vowels and another way for consonants.
Yeah.
So that's the IPA. You're all familiar with
but these are
IPA.
the vowel description and the consonant description. They were completely unrelated.
It was the Prague school, Trubetskoy and Group,
And Jakobsen,
and who first suggested another way of looking at it. That is in terms of the distinctive feature systems that we are all familiar with now, right? And this started in the late 50s. Late 40s.
Yeah, we're not good at the years anyway.
No, but the
before SPE anyway.
No, it's not just. It's long before SPE. It was the Jakobsen van Tale paper in the early 50s.
Yeah, this is the
where
the
it
famous.
got established.
That's right. Yeah, the idea here was that when you say something like voiced, voiceless, or bilabial, labial, dental, etc., you're talking about categories of segments, phonological segments.
Yeah, so when you have a feature features and feature values, when you say that you have a feature like voice and its values are plus and minus, then you're saying there are two categories of sounds, the plus voice and the minus voice. So in that sense, distinctive features are really a system of classification.
In contrast, if you go to IPA, there is this let's say parameter of place of articulation is the dimension, and there are, let's say, 7 or 8 multi-valued. It's not binary valued. That's how the IPA system worked.
And the descriptions there were the 3-term labels. Okay.
But now from the idea of classifying segments, this was an important idea, that it was seen that segments are composed of these features and feature values. So the first sound in bit is composed of plus voice, plus labial, etc. This is actually categorization, in seen as compositionality, which is very interesting.
Right, and that continued till, there were minor refinements of the distinctive feature system, but that generally continued up to SPE when rules became important in phonology.
But SPE continued that in SPE the rules applied to a string of segments, just one string. So should we talk about the non-linear structure, like syllable structure, or should we go to things
before that, just one main point, the distinction between IPA and the distinctive feature system. The distinctive feature system allowed a kind of cross-classification, cross-categorization that IPA didn't allow. And that was extremely useful for stating a huge bunch of regularities that you find, patterns that you find in the sound systems of languages.
Quite often people teach IPA and distinctive feature system as though IPA is phonetic and distinctive feature is phonological. No, they're both phonological, and they both try to express ways of articulating what is distinctive about a segment, what distinguishes one segment from the other segments. And this is supposed to be universal.
And this is partly because IPA is seen as, on the one hand, as the symbols, for the different sounds. You have to memorize the IPA kind of thing. And on the other, the system underlying it, what it is meant for, that gets forgotten very often. Okay. So that's
so should we now go to this segment internal structure and feature geometry, or should we go to things like syllable
actually structure? Again, before that,
okay,
the distinctive feature system had an influence on syntax, because that's how in the very early 70s you had a classification of words. Word classes were seen in terms of plus minus n, and that is plus minus noun, and plus minus v for plus minus verb, and you had a 4-way class, categorization of words.
So classification of words versus classification of segments. From phonology to syntax. It's the same idea. This came out in Chomsky's Remarks on Nominalization.
1971.
The plus minus noun and plus minus verb stuff. We're just trying to connect phonology and syntax. Okay.
So actually, after that comes the what's known as nonlinear phonology. There's a
metrical phonology, various
bunch
kinds.
of things that happened with that. Metrical phonology, autosegmental phonology. In terms of phenomena, you had syllable structure, right? Which and generalizations in terms of syllables rather than just the string of sounds. And then came stress and analysis of stress, perspective on stress that was very different, and through light and again a whole bunch of things where things like
autosegmental phonology.
There was autosegmental phonology, and then came McCarthy's Arabic, where he separated the tiers of vowels and of consonants and how they aligned. Right? And this is probably where for the first time that you had, I mean, they weren't seen in terms of this terminology, but you had the formation rules, the constraints or rules or constraints on the string, but you also had the correspondences or alignments between vowels and consonants, for example. And at the same time, there was also tones, how they were, the suprasegmentals and the segmentals being aligned.
I think this may be slightly difficult to understand without some details.
Drawings.
So let's take something like syllable structure. Until Khan came up with the idea of syllable structure, there was just a string. And Khan suggested on top of the phonological segments, that string, there is a syllable structure, where you could say that a syllable consists of, let's say, an onset and a rhyme. This is not necessarily the terminology that Khan used, doesn't matter. Now, this is a statement about the rules of syllable structure on top of the segment
rules
string.
Or what he gave was a template of a syllable.
Right. But the template can be, unpacked into formation rules. How do you construct syllables? A syllable consists of optional onset and obligatory rhyme. A rhyme consists of an obligatory nucleus and an optional coda and other things. How many segments in the coda, how many segments in the onset, how it is structured, and so on. And then, of course, you also have the segment structure rules, internal to. So, for example, you could have rules like if you have plus nasal, it must be plus voiced. That kind of stuff. These are segment structure rules. And then, so these are two different dimensions of representation, and there are rules which say that the nucleus can be filled only with sonorant segments. This is the correspondence rules between the syllable structure and the segment structure. This is the way such structure was seen: correspondence rules and formation rules.
And so you started having multi-tiered or multi-dimensional representations, and as these representations were seen as being more and more complex, more pieces got added to representations. The burden of capturing regularities, in some sense, shifted from the rule systems to the representation systems, right?
There was another, actually we should talk about the CV, the skeletal structure. So prior to this time, the idea was that segments were represented in that string. But then segmenthood of segments was factored out separately as what is called skeleton. At that time, the idea was that it could be CV, 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 or it could be X, 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 where X represented segment. Now, what are the properties of these X's? Then you would say that in terms of feature structure. So plus or minus voice, etc.
And the features actually told you whether there would be a C or a V. And also, C and V followed in some sense from the position in the syllable.
So if it is part of the nucleus, it's a V. If it is part of the onset or coda, it's a C. That's all. So it's enough to say X.
C and V did not mean consonant and vowel anymore.
Syllabic versus non-syllabic. These are actually structural properties rather than feature properties. And then came this idea of feature geometry, which said, instead of having a flat structure for the segment internal structure, that is also hierarchical. We will not probably go into the details. We won't have time to do all that stuff. But essentially to point out that there were lots of ideas which came out at that time, during that time, about the nature of representations, the structure of representation, the different pieces of information are factored out, that also had significant consequences to the way you state what the rules are like.
And it was a lot of fun being in the middle of that, right?
Yeah.
So it was, yes,
Yeah.
it was actually a very delightful time in linguistics,
Yeah.
because new ideas were coming up.
Yeah. Morris's course on metrical phonology and syllable structure was in
Absolutely.
78, which was, yeah. A lot of research came out of that single course that he offered. Yeah.
Okay, so shall we stop for
Let's stop. Yeah.
for comments
Yeah.
and questions? Okay, so we come to the third major component of a linguistic model, let's say, which is the aspect of modularity. What are the modules of grammar? How are they related, and so on? And
Yeah.
even within a module, you might have sub-modules. So what does that look like? Yeah.
So the word module may be perhaps a little confusing for linguistic students. Basic idea is that the human mind consists of different modules. So, for example, there is a module of vision, which is located roughly in certain areas of the brain. There is a module that is responsible for making decisions, which is in the prefrontal cortex and so on. So both the human brain and the human mind are organized in terms of modules. And these modules are internally, there is some degree of autonomy, but it is partial autonomy. They also interact.
And this is probably why we are so sort of habituated into putting everything into a box.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But this is an important idea in linguistics. So if you look at the syntactic structure, there's a module of phrase structure rules,
transformational
rules, and there is a lexicon, and these are the ways of organizing the grammar, okay, as far as linguistics is concerned. And if you look at classical phonemics, there were two kinds of rules. There were the morphophonemic rules. We are not going to go into the details of that, but we assume that everybody knows what these words mean. And there is the allophonic rules. So a rule such as, let us say, that the voiceless plosives are aspirated at the beginning of a stressed syllable. So in PIT, pit, the p is aspirated, but in SPIT, spit, the p is not aspirated. That is supposed to be an allophonic rule. But in contrast, you say something like, if you attach ity to something like divine, the I becomes E. That's a morphophonemic rule.
So divine, divinity, rapid, rapidity, so all of those, yes.
Yeah. So these two are seen as two distinct types of rules. And so there is in classical phonemics, there was a morphophonemic level of representation, and there is a phonological classical phonemic level of representation, and there is the phonetic level of representation. There are three levels of representation.
So this is when it might be useful to think in terms of two things. You have modules like phonology and semantics and syntax and so on, very broadly. And then within each of these, you have the phonemic level and the phonetic level.
Yeah.
In syntax, you would have the functional level and the categorical level or whatever. Right, and so it's in the when you talk about modularity, that the idea of levels of representation and dimensions of representation and so on enter into the picture.
Yeah. So in classical phonemics, there was the two types of rules. So a rule which changes one phoneme to another phoneme, that was a morphophonemic rule, and a rule that changes a phoneme to its allophone, that's a allophonic rule. And when Chomsky and Haller came to the scene, they demonstrated that this kind of organization was undesirable. We are not going to state the arguments, but it's a very powerful argument that the in-between level of representation, classical phonemic representation, resulted in duplication of the same generalization, one as a morphophonemic rule and the other one as an allophonic rule. So that intermediate level was abandoned, and there was the so-called morphophonemic level was called the underlying representation, and the phonetic representation. There were only two levels of representation.
Yeah, and the two levels were related by
phonological rules. And the phonological rules were sensitive to morphological information. There was no distinction between two types of rules, just phonological rules. Some of them happened to be sensitive to morphological information, others were not. That's all. This was challenged in the late 70s. We brought back some intuition of the classical phonemic level of representation by saying some of the rules apply in the lexicon, and the output of the rules that applied in the lexicon were called lexical level of representation. And then there were the post-lexical application of rules. The same rule system. It was not two types of rules. The same rule system, but just the modularity changed.
But without that kind of duplication that you had earlier.
Right. Yeah. So the argument that SPE advanced against classical phonemics did not apply. And there was another aspect to this modularity distinction, that the main claim that was being made was that speakers of a language are conscious of the outcome of the lexical rules, but they're not conscious of the outcome of the post-lexical rules.
So this is why, for example, we mentioned Malayalam speaker, we mentioned tempo. A Malayalam speaker of English, Malayali English, would say temple with a b, but think that they're saying per, and hear it as per. Now that is when you could think of it as what the speaker is conscious of, right?
Yeah.
So the speaker's intuition, if you wish.
Yeah. So there was lots of argument about the so-called psychological reality of phonological representations and its relation to things like speech errors and language games, the play languages and so on. And various
errors, language errors.
Yeah.
Now I do have to point out that this idea actually was inspired by the same move in syntax, where you had, for example, in the early 70s with Chomsky's remarks on nominalization. Until then, the idea was that there was something called the lexicon, and the lexicon contained everything that was idiosyncratic. Now, it was only in the early 70s that changed, and the idea came that you could have regularities in the lexicon. You could actually have rules in the lexicon.
Yeah.
So
Chomsky suggested that the relation between, let us say, destroy and destruction was expressed in the module of the lexicon. So the lexicon was no longer a storehouse of idiosyncrasies. So derivation morphology happened in the lexicon.
And from taking off from that, in syntax, for example, in lexical functional grammar, it was shown that the passive morphology, the passive it was not really a rule, but passive morphology, which was so directly connected to syntax, had to happen in the lexicon. Hence the lexical functional grammar.
So things like passive, causative, there was lexical causative, lexical passive, lexical applicative, all these things took place in the module of the lexicon. So in Malayalam, for example, the relation between urangi, slept, and urakki, made to sleep.
Caused to sleep.
Yeah.
Put to sleep. Put to sleep.
Yeah. Odi, pichu, etc., etc. These are causatives, which is morphological causatives.
With a direct impact on syntax, and these were part of the lexicon.
Yeah. So the relation between urangi and uraki, nga to ka, this had to happen in the lexicon.
So this was in the mid-70s and inspired that move to the lexical level of representation in phonology.
Yeah. This was one of the motivations for one aspect of lexical phonology. There are different motivations for some of the ideas in lexical phonology, but the so-called psychological reality of phonological representation was one of the motivations. And this is independent of the rule versus constraint, the procedural versus declarative formalisms and so on. So everything in lexical phonology can be in fact translated into constraints. It doesn't make a difference.
Yeah, actually, a lot of these controversies about whether it be about representations or about rules versus constraints or whether you need a particular module or not, these are sometimes quite trivial.
Yeah.
And if you look at the substance of these, the theoretical substance behind these, without being locked into any particular wholesale theory, it becomes much easier to see the substance behind it. Yeah.
So one thing we should point out is, even though we have been talking, we are both phonologists. Our primary interest is phonology.
I'm not a phonologist.
Okay, all right, whatever. I'm not a phonologist either. I was a phonologist once upon a time, not anymore.
So I wrote a syntax thesis from a phonologist perspective.
Yeah, and I declare myself as a non-phonologist. But the past, okay. We have been talking in terms of theoretical phonology, but it also applies to theoretical phonetics, linguistic phonetics. And some of these so-called post-lexical rules are actually not category-changing rules, but quantitative rules. So, for example, var length, when you have a voiced consonant versus a voiceless consonant, when you have a fricative versus non-fricative, etc. There are interesting rules about, or laws about, var length, and the rule about the on glide that we mentioned earlier after the voiced consonant. These are all not category changing rules, but category adjusting, the quantitative rules. And there's this question, what is the nature of phonetic representation? Is phonetic representation purely discrete? That can you do segment 1, segment 2, segment 3, etc. And within segment there are no differences. It became fairly clear very soon, by when phonologists and phoneticians, the lab phoneticians, started interacting, that the earlier conception of phonetic representation in terms of strings of discrete segments, that was no longer possible. There were no segments in phonetic representation. We are not going to go into the details once again.
Except that, just to say that there were a lot of transitions, and many of these transitions between so-called segments were important, and you really didn't know where one segment ended and the next one began.
So this is also tied up with the problems of segmenting speech. So P-R-I-N-C-E, there's a t between n and s, but that t is different from P-R-I-N-T-S, and you can hear the difference. This is a durational matter. There were a large number of questions, and the questions still continue about problems of segmenting speech in a universal fashion. You have to know the language in order to be able to segment the speech. And segmentation at the phonetic level of representation, it is probably not the case that they are in terms of discrete segments.
And of course, the whole the whole issue becomes even more problematic if you also look at the suprasegmental levels.
We won't even
touch that. We'll leave it to the experts for that.
Also, we should leave a lot of stuff for graduate students, not the experts. I'm talking about the beginners, because they have whole life again,
to find out
things that we found problematic. Right. So, but our job is to point to the problems that we have not been able to solve. Okay. Is this a good time
for questions and comments? Clarificatory
questions.
Clarificatory questions, yes. Okay, so we now come to the fifth and final part of this conversation.
Fifth or sixth?
It's a fifth. It's a fifth.
Yeah, I can't count.
Doesn't matter. You could never count. So, all right. So this is the fifth part, and something that we need to say at this point. This was supposed to be pulling all the pieces together. We'll do it. We'll try to do something like that. But before that, given that this was a kind of spontaneous conversation, we didn't have slides, and I don't think it doesn't make sense to put slides in, but what we will do is we will send out a written version, more elaborate written version, especially because we mentioned formalisms and notations, we mentioned examples, but and some of those things are difficult to understand unless you see them, you know,
in a PDF file.
Yeah. So we'll send a PDF document, more detailed one.
In that, we'll also make some connections to syntax and other things, semantics. And
that will depend on how it comes out when we write it.
I think we should do that.
We will, but we don't know how it will come out when we write it.
Look, but whenever I say something about linguistics, I talk about physics and
that's true.
So it's bound to happen.
Okay. So I think we will leave the pulling the pieces together part of it for that document.
Yeah.
And for now, is there something that you want to say by way of summing up and, you know?
Yeah, I think we began by saying that it is important to distinguish between the leading theoretical ideas and theoretical questions based on those ideas and the details of implementation, the conceptual aspects. Then we talked about the formalisms, important, but not as important as the conceptual issues. And then the notation, which is least important. It's a matter of saying.
Actually, I don't know if you can say the notation is least important. It might be least important, but it is still important because I mean, imagine if you use notation without knowing what it means.
Then it's terrible. Yeah. That's like using the Arabic numeral system without knowing what it means. Of course, to that extent. But in this hierarchy, the least important, let's say.
Okay.
Right. That was one. And then we talked about some of the major aspects of the rule systems. So we talked about constraint versus rule, rule ordering versus constraint ranking or interaction, and so on. And two kinds of related to representations. We talked about constraints that hold at one level, which we call the formation rules or formation constraints, formation templates, if you wish, and rules or laws that connect two dimensions of representation or two levels of representation.
Correspondence.
That's right. And this is important to remember for solving many problems in phonology. It's important to understand that the relations between rules or laws or constraints is a matter of A, defeasible logic or non-monotonic logic. Let me use the word logic. This is the formalism that is needed on the one hand. And the other is the distinction between level internal or dimension internal and across dimensional statements of regularities. This may be difficult to understand in a conversation of this kind, but we'll try to do that in the written version. Then we talked about the nature of representations, how from the kinds of representations that we had in the sound pattern of English, phonology evolved into fairly complex systems of representation of different levels and different dimensions of representation, different kinds of structures.
And where the representations became complex enough to carry the burden of the linguistic system.
Yeah.
And this was true in phonology and in
syntax. And in fact, even semantics versus,
in all of those, yes.
Then we talked about the modularity. Modularity has two aspects at least. One is where the rules or constraints hold. It could be the same set of constraints, system of constraints, but depending upon where they hold, they will have different consequences to the phenomena. And the other is modularity also gives rise to, if you're thinking in terms of input-output, the input to a module versus output of a module. But the input and output need not necessarily be seen as, procedures. In mathematics, people use the word function, and they also talk about input to function and output of the function. But that doesn't mean that function is a procedure. Function is simply a statement of a certain kind of relation. So this idea is neutral to the procedural versus non-procedural.
We might be going too far out.
Okay, that's true. So let's kind of, these are the three things that we broadly talked about. And the rest of it, I think, we'll have to do in the written version.
And also, I think we'll now take general questions,
Yeah.
not even, I mean, till now we had said only clarificatory questions. So now, actually, not even questions, we will
Comments.
just have a discussion.
Yeah,
Let's
comments and criticisms, objections,
suggestions.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks for listening.